Make sure we're going. Yes, we are. Okay, just some real quick questions for you now. Get
Sure.
out of here. Well, first off, why Dalmatian Twin Flags? Why did you decide to do that? I'm going to ask you, what do you hope that people took home with them, the take-home message, if you will?
Mm-hmm.
Are there some characteristics about that plant that some people may not know about? Something that's just not really out of the ordinary?
Yeah, kind of interesting about it.
Yeah.
Relevant. Yeah.
So I guess why Toad Flax?
Yeah. Okay.
Take-home message.
So why toad flax, and that's kind of like a career thing for me. It's kind of one of my pet species, and I think the reason is when we think about invasion, I always think about it on kind of continuum. And what I mean by that is for each species, it starts off with a single population in the area, in this case the state, and then spreads, right? So you got those species that are really early on. Medusa head and ventonata would be great examples that we thought were in that case. And then you've got something like Canada thistle, which is on the other extreme, where it's pretty much everywhere. If you were to dig up a teaspoon of soil anywhere in Wyoming, you're probably going to find some Canada thistle seed. It's just a matter of the right environment for it to establish.
Okay.
Then there's somewhere in between, and that's where I like to work because, well, I like to work on the early side of things or in between. And I think Dalmatian toadflax is a great example of that, where it's not Canada thistle. It hasn't spread everywhere it can. I think there's still a lot of opportunity to slow that spread. But there's a lot of people that are currently having issues with it. And I think you can get a lot of traction from an extension standpoint if you're working with something that people are seeing with their own eyes spread, which is, I'm sure, what you heard at that field day also. Yeah. So that's why I've picked Dalmatian toadflax. Now, another reason is that it's a really hard to manage species. And partly it's for some of the things that I previously mentioned at the field day, that it's a perennial plant, which means not only are you fighting its seeds that it's producing, but you're fighting the plants themselves. So you have to control both elements. And in terms of kind of an interesting tidbit about Dalmatian toadflax relevant to management is that it has really waxy leaves. And in fact, if you take two leaves and kind of rub them together, they almost squeak because they're so waxy. That's what gives them that bluish color. That's kind of a unique vegetative color from everything else around it. That's also what makes it really hard to manage with most herbicides, because that wax acts like a protective coating, a coat of armor, I suppose, for the plant that a lot of other plants don't have.
Okay.
Another fun fact from an introduction standpoint is Dalmatian toadflax was intentionally introduced here. So we brought it here intentionally, like we do for many invasive species. But what's really neat is we have horticulturalist records of the folks who were bringing it here and monitoring it, because they brought it here as an ornamental, because it's got those pretty yellow snapdragon-like flowers. And there's records of it being established in the Northeast, where I don't have the exact quote, but basically they're saying, well, it seems to survive really well, but it's not very pretty. And it's just like such a perfect first statement for an invasive that, it's this, it seems to do really well, but we don't really think it's all that pretty. And here we are 100 years later, and now it's one of the most problematic species in the western U.S.
Well, I wanted to ask you, is it because the plant itself, when it starts, I can't talk this morning.
Take your time.
I don't see a lot of individual plants. When I see it, it's always in clusters or patches, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem for the ranchers because it takes up the grazing. Okay. And can you give me an indication just how aggressive it can be?
Sure, yeah. What's really interesting about a lot of these perennial species is how it takes one good year and they can just absolutely explode. So what happens often is, and I hear this often, and I sometimes believe it and sometimes don't, people will say, I didn't have this plant, and now this year it's just everywhere. And a lot of the times that's partly I wasn't looking for it in previous years, and I finally opened my eyes to it, and now I realize it's everywhere. But there is some validity in that. I think what happens often is, you might have some, but just a little bit for years and years, and then you get that one ideal year, whether it's a wet spring, as we're having this year, which is benefiting a lot of species, or maybe a dry summer, and that benefits your invader because it's better able to tolerate those conditions, and suddenly that plant just explodes. And I think that's what's really interesting, is it's not always just it grew another foot in diameter of the population this year, and it grew another foot. It can go, and suddenly you feel like you have it everywhere, and it's because you didn't know you had seed there the whole time. Those seeds are just sitting and waiting for that right condition to occur. Does that answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, when I was talking to one of the ranchers, Nina, I can't remember, Haas, I can't remember her last
Yeah, I
name.
think I know. Yeah, yep.
But she said that they had used herbicides 5 or 6 years ago, knocked it back pretty good, but now it's coming back. But there was another person at the very beginning of that trial who said something about what is your level of control, or what is your, yeah, was that what he asked? It was something about just how much you tried to control this thing.
Yeah, I think there was a question of, and maybe I'm misinterpreting what you're asking,
Well,
but
it was that the first question before we went out.
yeah, okay, so it is what I'm thinking of then. Yeah, so an individual asked me, how do you decide when to control? It's kind of like a threshold question. Like, when should we be managing? And it's a huge question that I still stand by is not easy to tackle even in a single interview. But my response to a question like that is it really is dictated by land management goals. And not only that, but where the species is in the invasion. So for example, yellow star thistle is another perennial invader that currently we don't know of any populations that exist in Wyoming. But in the past we've had, I think it's 4 or 5 independent populations that have been found and eradicated. Very, very small population. So in that case, the answer is to, when do I manage, how much do I manage is as quickly as you can and as much as you can. Because the concern there is that we don't want it to spread, right? The primary focus is not necessarily the impact of what that plant is doing right there, right now. It's what it potentially can do 10 years down the road, right? Now for something like cheatgrass, which is what he had a question about, which is on the other side of that spectrum, which is a well-established species that, again, the seed's probably almost everywhere in Wyoming in a lot of cases. How do you decide when and what to manage? And that becomes a lot more dictated by the goals and the priorities of that land usage. So in some cases, it might be zero tolerance. And that is just, we don't have a lot on here, and we're going to go and hit it really hard, and we might do some collateral damage, but when we look at it relative to the potential spread in the future, it's validated. For someone else, it might be, we need to ensure that we don't have more than 30% cheatgrass density anywhere, because that is an acceptable level for grazing to still occur on that land and not totally degrade it in some cases. And that would be based on environmental conditions and things like that, but that's a really hard question, and that's why I always tell people, if you are at that point in your question, and contact myself or some of the other experts in the state to have that conversation, to really clearly define your goals and then build your management program around those goals. Because I think people take that for granted. They just want to kill plants.
Right. Well, if I'm a rancher, then when do I start? I should have asked her that. When do I start feeling uncomfortable about it? About Dalmatian toadflax? I mean,
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends. Again, it depends on your goals, I would say. But my argument, if I was a rancher and I have a piece of land, it would be somewhat of a zero tolerance. And the reason I say that is I don't want to be on that threshold line of, okay, at 30% cover of Dalmatian toadflax, my cattle now are, I don't know the number.
I know, that just seems humongous.
Yeah, so even at that point, now my cattle can no longer, there's not enough other vegetation for them to really be grazing this area, right? So that might be the critical threshold of this land is now, of questionable abandonment or management. Well, I think you save a lot of money if you don't let it get to that point, because with every increasing, with the increasing density of Dalmatian toadflax is the decreasing density of your other desirable plants you want, and getting those back is hard. That's the hard part. I always joke people, killing plants is easy. It's getting what you want there that's hard. Yeah. And I think the hardest situation is to be in a super dense stand of Dalmatian toadflax and say, how do we return this to something that we would actually utilize from a grazing standpoint? I think the better question is 5 years prior saying, what do we do? How do we monitor this landscape so that if we do see Dalmatian toadflax on here, we are aggressively managing it so that we don't ever get to that point, right? But to have those proper herbicide options is really critical for that too. And that's why I do work like this, that you can go out and maybe do a single treatment and not have to be following every single other year with another herbicide application, because that's not good for that typically for that vegetative community either.
Right. Okay. Okay, what was the other question? Well, I was going to ask if there's a tipping point with this plan, but that's not really pertinent.
I want to answer that question anyway.
Yeah,
I'm sure there is, and the thing is we don't have that information. So even cheatgrass, which is, I would say the poster child of invasive plants in the western U.S., we don't have good information on that tipping point. So if you don't have it for cheatgrass, typically you can assume we don't have good information for other species, and that's why I'd rather be in the somewhat of a precautionary principle and just let's manage it before we suddenly have that outbreak from that ideal year that really lets Dalmatian toadflax explode, or any other invader for that matter.
Okay. Take-home messages that you hope got across.
Take-home messages from this event would be one, that frankly herbicides aren't the only option and that an integrated approach is appropriate, but that understanding not all management approaches are applicable to all situations is really important, because I think some people, they're like, well, I'm a biocontrol person and I'm just going to use biocontrol. And I think biocontrol is really important in some scenarios, and I think it's completely it's not feasible as a management tool in other scenarios, and herbicide might be the right option. Or frankly, we talked about hand pulling and mechanical control. In some situations, that might be an appropriate management strategy as long as there's understanding of the biology of that plant and what it's going to take to mechanically remove it. So I think the big takeaway is that there isn't one silver bullet, and often having an approach of thinking about multiple management strategies on your landscape is probably going to lead to the best result. We call it integrated pest management, but it's really true. And that, I think, was a great example where we had two different management strategies, both just as valid as the other one, in different situations. So that'd be my biggest takeaway. Other smaller takeaways. Oh, another one is, we looked at these herbicide trials, and I don't know if you're able to get one of the sheets, but my intent on that sheet was typically what we show as scientists is how well do we control the target species, and obviously that's the first really important question, but the second one for me is then what did the plant community do around it? Mm-hmm. Because again, I can kill plants. I can go out there and I can make sure we create a moonscape out of something, but really that's not what our goal ever is. It's to get rid of one plant and keep everything else. So when looking at the effect of a herbicide, you should be looking at not only effect on the target species, but also everything else around it. And that's what these study plots are intended to do, is look at both of those elements. And that's why I gave them the information of at least species richness as one example of a metric of how well is the community doing around based on that herbicide treatment. Okay. Those would be my two big takeaways.
Okay. The other observation I had was people really seem to really get into the collecting the weevils.
They did.
Was that based upon the possibility of using them at their place, or was it because just curiosity?
I think it's both. It's the crummy answer, but I think it's truly both. That it's, I think most people that have done weed management, they've sprayed herbicide to some extent. It's not a novel thing to them, but to go out and use respirators and use bug nets, and
right.
It's kind of a neat concept. The fact that you're collecting a living organism that's going to do theoretically good for you if everything goes well, it's just kind of it's a neat concept, right? Biocontrol is it's a feel-good management strategy, undoubtedly. And then also the fact that, those weevils are not inexpensive, and to go out with an expert in the field in Bruce Shambaugh and collect weevils and then take them home yourself to try to get a release site, that's really incredible. And it's not only incredible for them, but it's a really neat opportunity for us in the weed management world, because he also gave them a sheet that was basically a release information form. So it gives him the information of where did you release them and how much, so that we can track those things and try to maybe make better decisions based on what's successful and what's not. And I think just that whole integration of you do the collection, you do the release, you give that information is a really neat, comprehensive approach to biocontrol that I think is often, a lot of people, they'll buy a couple thousand biocontrol and throw them out in the land and hopefully it's good, but now you have some interaction with the USDA in this case that's going to somewhat monitor that. So I think it all kind of made it interesting to the end user.
Okay. Is this thing affected by altitude?
Dalmatian toadflax. So all plants are affected by altitude, right? Now, in terms of, we tend to think of, so there's yellow toadflax, which is a very related species in the same genus. It tends to be a little more successful at higher elevations, but I don't like to, things have been said in the past, like cheatgrass only goes up to, X, I think it's like 9,000 feet or something. I don't even want to say the number because I don't remember what it is. But those rules of thumb have always been broken. And my fear is that if you say things like that, people are no longer careful in monitoring in areas that they think are not susceptible. A case in point, Dalmatian toadflax. So I've got some research with the remote sensing stuff that Chloe Matilio, my student's more involved in. So we're doing a lot of that up in the Greater Yellowstone ecoregion, and up there, they're more and more concerned about Dalmatian toadflax that has originally established in the valleys and seems to be creeping up those really rocky, harsh slopes into some relatively high elevations. And we don't know how high they're going to potentially go. And I think to set a kind of anecdotal threshold of, this is where they can be of concern and not, I think it's just dangerous to do unless you've done very careful studying, which has not been done on this species.
Well, the only reason I ask is I was up on Sheep Mountain, up on the trail. It's about 9,500 feet. Mm-hmm. And I swear, I could be wrong, but I swear I saw some up there.
Oh, there's no doubt. So if you go up the Snowy Range on 130 there, I would say less than 3 miles from when you crest up and over where they got the little viewing area. Look on the observation post. Look on the right side of the road, and you're going to see Dalmatian toadflax, and that's at least 9.5, 9.8, something around there. So it's in terms of elevation being a thing that we can count on to keep it at bay, I would not in any way hope on that.
Okay. I can't think of anything else, Dan.
Okay.
I'll write it, send it to you to look at before I send it out.
Great.
I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming, Di. I hope it was a good time for you. I always enjoy you being there, like I've said before.
I enjoyed it. I enjoy talking to the ranchers and stuff. Thanks, man.
I agree, absolutely. Thank you.